enslaved. It was the darkest moment of Louis's life. The bird stood over him, triumphant. I am in command, he said. You will obey. Commander Fitzgerald forked forward on his crutches and assumed the duties of senior POW. Ringing with shock, Louis picked himself up and hiked to the barracks, a tumble-down warehouse on the edge of a cliff over the Hakura River. Wind whistled through the walls, snow fell through holes in the roof, and rats trotted along the baseboards. The beds were planks, the bedding was loose straw. To survive sub-zero temperatures, the POWs had pried up and burned the floorboards, leaving gaping holes. The 300 residents, mostly Australians, were stick figures, wearing the ragged summer uniforms in which they'd been captured years before. Stacked against the wall were dozens of boxes, some of which had spilled gray ash to the floor. These were the cremated remains of 60 POWs, one in every 5, who died here, most from relentless physical abuse. Of the many hells Louis had known in the war, this would be the worst. Natsu was almost lethally cold. Each night of shivering ended before dawn, when Louis was forced outside for roll call in deep snow and howling wind. By day, he huddled with Tinker and Wade, fighting worsening diarrhea and fever. The Natsuo rations, mostly seaweed, didn't help him, because all the guards smoked American cigarettes. The prisoners knew the Red Cross was sending relief boxes. The POWs got nothing. Louis' transfer back to the bird was no coincidence. Watanabe, whom the Aussies called Watana Bastard, had handpicked him, almost certainly to torment him. Almost the moment Louis walked into camp, the bird was on him. Louis took his beatings with defiance, provoking the bird to ever more violent attacks. He descended back into a state of profound stress. And yet Louis was lucky. Natsuo was a war production village, and the enlisted POWs were its slaves. Each day they were marched into factories, a steel mill, and barges, doing dangerous, backbreaking labor in shifts of some 18 hours. At the shift's end, Louis saw men rambling in, some so exhausted they had to be carried. The Japanese literally worked men to death at Natsu. Louis had much to bear, but because he was an officer, at least he didn't have that. Winter faded, the snow melted. A pig appeared. All winter he'd been living in a snow cavern, sustained by food dropped to him by an Australian. Louis looked at him in wonder. The animal's skin had become see-through. When the ground thawed, the bird announced he was sending the officers to a farm to labor. Though this violated the Geneva Convention, Fitzgerald knew it would keep his officers away from the bird and couldn't be anything like the killing labor done by the enlisted men. He raised no protest. Each morning, Louis and the other officers assembled, attended by a guard, Agawa. They loaded a cart with benjo waste, used as fertilizer, yoked themselves to it, and pulled it to the farm, sometimes darting away to steal vegetables from fields while Agawa's back was turned. The 6-mile walk was tiring, but the work, tending potatoes, was easy, and the Agawa was placid. And because they were working, the officers were granted full rations. Though rations were dwindling as Japan's fortunes fell, a full bowl of seaweed was better than a half bowl of seaweed. April 13th was a bright day, the land bathed in sunshine, the sky wide and clear. Louis and the other officers were scattered over the farm, working, when the fields suddenly went still and the men turned up their faces. At the same moment, all over Natsu, POWs in Japan gazed up. High overhead, something was winking in the sunlight, white ribbons unfurling behind it. It was a B-29, the first to cross over Natsu. Followed by innumerable eyes, the plane made a lonely arc from one horizon to the other. It dropped no bombs, but its appearance showed how far over Japan the Americans were venturing, and how little resistance the Japanese could offer. The POWs were elated. The Japanese were unnerved, none more than the bird. A few days later, Agawa teased Watanabe about his lazy laborers. He meant no harm, but the remark sent the bird into a fury. He shouted for the farm workers to line up, then stormed and frothed, thoroughly deranged. Finally, he screamed his punishment: from now on, all officers would do hard labor on coal barges. If they refused, he'd execute every one of them. One look at the bird told Fitzgerald this was an order he couldn't fight. The next morning, as the officers were marched into slavery, the bird watched. He was smiling. The officers were taken to the river and crowded onto a barge heaped with coal. 6 were given shovels. Louis and the rest had large baskets strapped to their backs. And on the guards' orders, the shovelers began heaving coal into the baskets. A cubic foot of coal can weigh as much as 60 pounds, so the bearers were soon staggering. With the guards screaming at them, they were hounded off the barge and up the riverbank to a rail car, where they wobbled up a narrow ramp, dumped the coal, and returned to have their baskets refilled. All day the men labored. By the time they were allowed to stop, they were utterly spent. By Wade's estimate, each basket bearer had carried well over 4 tons of coal. So began a daily routine. Each time the men finished one barge, another arrived. Then one day they were loaded onto an empty barge and taken into the Sea of Japan. The barge drew alongside a coal ship, the sea heaving, water spraying over the deck. A guard gestured to a net slung over the side of the ship. "Jump onto the net," he said, "then climb to the deck." The POWs were appalled. The 2 vessels were crashing together and rolling apart, and the net was rapidly moving target. The men balked, but the guards forced them forward, and POWs began jumping. Louis, terrified, sprang across and climbed clear. He was hustled into the ship's hold to a giant dome of coal beside a large hanging net. He was given a shovel, and the guards were suddenly teeming around him, cracking him with clubs. Hour after hour, Louis stooped over his shovel in a swirl of shouting guards and black dust, heaving coal into the net. At last, at day's end, the work was halted. The POWs were so caked in coal that they were indistinguishable. Every morning the men were sent to their shovels again. Every night they dragged back to the barracks, black ghosts trudging in and falling onto their bunks, weary to the bones, spitting black saliva. Occasionally Louis was switched from coal to industrial salt. The work was just liquefied in his sweat and ran down his back, burning cracks in his skin. Tragedy was inevitable. One day, as Louis stood on the barge, awaiting his jump to the ship, the man had mistimed his leap. Crushed between the vessels, he crumpled onto the barge. The guards hardly paused, pushing Louis to step past the man and jump. Louis never learned whether the man survived. Slavery swallowed men's souls, but the POWs scored little victories. On the barges, they'd sneak to the galleys and stuff food into their clothes. The guards' lunch boxes kept vanishing, and overseers' cigarettes, set down as he turned away, were gone when he turned back. The POWs stole anything they could, risking their necks for something as trivial as a pencil box. The box itself was nothing. The theft of it, a tiny act of defiance, was everything. In the Benjo one day, Louis noticed something blocking a knothole in the wall. Looking closer, he realized it was a rice sack in his storage room on the other side of the wall. Remembering the Amari sugar thieves, he searched camp, found a hollow reed, and sharpened the end. That night, he donned his camp issue pajamas, fitted with ankle strings. He tied the strings tight, headed to the Benjo, jammed one end of the reed through the knothole, piercing the rice sack, and then put the other end into his pajamas. Rice streamed through the reed and into his pants. Louis left the Benjo, moving as naturally as he could with 10 pounds of rice in his pajamas. He strolled past the guards and into the barracks, where Fitzgerald waited. A blanket spread before him. Louis stepped on the blanket, untied his ankle strings, and let the rice spill out. Fitzgerald quickly folded the blanket, then hid the rice in socks and compartments he'd made in the walls. When the guards left the building, Louis and Fitzgerald rushed the rice to the heating stove, boiled it, and shared it with the other POWs. In Natsu's POW insurgency, perhaps the greatest fear was pulled off by Ken Marvin, a Marine captured at Wake. When Marvin's one-eyed slave guard, Bad Eye, asked Marvin to teach him his language, Marvin began teaching Bad Eye catastrophically bad English. From that day forward, when asked, "How are you?" Bad Eye would simply say, "What the F do you care?" Disaster struck Louis in April. He was lugging a load of salt up the rail car ramp when a guard started walking down. The guard threw out his elbow, sending Louis tumbling off the ramp. Landing feet first, Louis felt a tearing sensation, then scorching pain in his ankle and knee. Louis couldn't walk. He hopped back to the and was removed from salt duty. He would now be the only officer trapped in camp with the bird all day, and his rations would be halved. Louis lay in the barracks, ravenous, crippled by his injured leg, diarrhea, and a 104-degree fever. To get his rations restored, he had to find work he could do on one leg. Desperate, he begged the bird for work. The bird savored his plea. From now on, he said, Louis would care for the pig. He'd get full rations, but there was a catch. He'd have to use his bare hands to clean the sty. Emaciated and seriously ill, Louis was condemned to crawl on the ground, picking and cramming handfuls of the pig's feed into its mouth to save himself from starving to death. If anything's going to shatter me, Louis thought, this is it. And that's the end of chapter 28. We'll get to chapter 29.